Have you ever just looked at a world map and wondered, why there? Why does that one specific region of the world have nearly half of all the planet's oil? Well, it's not a coincidence, and it's definitely not just luck. It's the result of an incredible geological lottery that took hundreds of millions of years to play out. So to really understand why the Middle East became the world's energy powerhouse, we've got to travel way back in time, deep into Earth's history, to a world you wouldn't even recognize. All right, so here's how we're going to break this epic story down. First, we'll look at the 500 million year recipe for making all this oil. Then we'll jump ahead to the wild black gold rush of the 20th century. After that, we'll see how all that oil completely redrew the map and forced some pretty creative political deals. Then we'll get into the hard numbers of just how dominant the region is today. And finally, we'll ask the big question, what's next? Okay, let's dive right in. Part 1, the geological lottery. And here's the crazy part. To understand the deserts we see in the Middle East today, we have to imagine a totally different world. We're talking about the bottom of a warm, tropical ocean that covered this whole area millions and millions of years ago. But before we go any deeper, let's just clear something up. Where does oil really come from? I know we all grew up hearing it was dinosaurs, right? Well, sorry to burst that bubble, but it's not. The real story is actually way, way older, and it has absolutely nothing to do with T-Rexes. It's all about trillions and trillions of tiny little sea creatures. You know, creating this much oil isn't something that just happens. It's like following a very specific 4-step recipe over an insane amount of time. First, you need an ancient ocean absolutely teeming with life. Second, you gotta have the perfect conditions to preserve all that stuff when it dies so it doesn't just rot away. Third, you bury it and cook it under insane heat and pressure. And the final step, you need a perfect natural container to trap it all. And here's the kicker. The area we now call the Middle East just happened to hit the jackpot and have all 4 of these things, not just a little, but in massive, unbelievable quantities. So ingredient number 1 is what geologists call the source rock. Just think of it as the geological kitchen. For literally hundreds of millions of years, you had this constant rain of dead plankton and algae falling to the bottom of this ancient ocean, the Tethys Ocean. It built up layer after layer after layer of organic gunk. As those layers got buried deeper and deeper, the heat and pressure started to do their work, a super slow cooking process that turned all that organic matter into what we now know as oil and natural gas. Okay, so the oil is cooked, but where does it go? Now, it doesn't just sit in giant underground lakes or caves, which is a common misconception. Instead, it slowly seeps into porous rocks, like limestone or sandstone. These rocks act like a giant natural sponge, soaking it all up. And this is what's so amazing. The Middle East just happens to have these incredibly thick, incredibly absorbent sponge rocks. This means they can hold a mind-boggling amount of oil, but it also means it's way easier and cheaper to get it out. That's a huge economic advantage that was literally baked in from the very start. Right, but what good is a sponge if there's nothing to stop the oil from just leaking out? That's where the final piece of our geological puzzle comes in, the cap rock. This is basically the lid. It's a super dense, totally impermeable layer of rock, often thick layers of salt, that sits on top. It acts just like a lid on a pressure cooker, stopping the oil and gas from escaping and trapping all of it underground for millions and millions of years. So we've got the kitchen, the sponge, and the lid. All the ingredients are there. But there's one more event that really put the cherry on top. It was this epic, slow-motion car crash. Around 35 million years ago, the Arabian Plate came crashing into the Eurasian Plate. This colossal collision literally buckled the Earth's crust, folding all those rock layers into these huge dome shapes. And that created the perfect traps, funneling all that oil and gas into the massive, concentrated superfields that exist today. So for millions of years, this unbelievable treasure just sat there, hidden deep underground, which begs the question, how did we finally find it? Well, that takes us to part 2, the black gold rush of the 20th century, a discovery that would change, well, pretty much everything. Man, the 20th century was just a whirlwind. You had colonial powers drawing these straight lines on maps, like with the Ukiah Convention in 1922, which created this weird neutral zone between what would become Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. They had absolutely no idea what they were drawing lines over. But then, 1938 happened. Oil was struck in both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and suddenly, everyone's heads turned. 10 years later, in 1948, they hit the absolute motherlode, the Ghawar field. This wasn't just a big discovery, it was a find of legendary scale. It was the moment the region's fate as an energy superpower was sealed. I mean, just to try and wrap your head around the scale of this thing, the Ghawar field is 174 miles long. That's like an underground ocean of oil stretching from New York City almost all the way to Boston. It's just insane. For decades, this one single field has pumped out millions of barrels of oil every single day. It's probably generated more wealth than any other single natural resource anywhere in the entire history of humanity. But finding oil fields this massive creates a whole new kind of problem, right? Because these huge underground reservoirs, they don't care about the lines people draw on a map. They just are. So what do you do when a single oil field sits under two different countries? How do you split it up? That's what we're diving into in part 3, Oil, Borders, and Bargains. Well, it basically forced these nations to get really creative, and they came up with all sorts of unique solutions. Take that neutral zone, for instance. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait just decided, hey, let's run it together and split everything 50-50. Then you've got the world's largest natural gas field, which is shared by Qatar and Iran. There, they just each develop their own half. And then there's this really interesting deal where Saudi Arabia manages the Abu Safa field, but splits the profits with its tiny neighbor, Bahrain. It's all about diplomacy driven by geology. So all of this history, all these discoveries and deals, they've shaped the world we live in today. Which brings us to part 4. Let's look at the numbers and see just how big of a deal the Middle East really is on the world stage. All right, time for some numbers. First up, proven reserves. That's just the fancy term for the oil we're pretty sure is down there and that we can actually get out of the ground. And the numbers are just jaw-dropping. Now, technically, Venezuela is number 1 because of all its super heavy oil, but when you talk about the easy-to-get conventional stuff, the Middle East is king. Saudi Arabia is sitting at number 2 in the world, and Iran is right behind at number 3. But having oil in the ground is one thing. Pumping it out is another. And production, how much you're actually pulling up every single day, that's what really controls the global market. Right now, the US is actually the top producer, thanks to the whole shale boom. But that oil is expensive to get. Saudi Arabia is the true anchor of the market. Because of their amazing geology, they can turn the taps up or down pretty easily and cheaply. That gives them huge influence over the price of oil for all of us. So, here's the big takeaway. When you add everything up, this one region, which, remember, is the result of a 500 million year geological fluke, is sitting on almost half of the entire planet's proven oil reserves. Think about that. 48%. That one number has dictated so much of global politics, economics, and war for the last 100 years. And having all that oil in one place makes getting it out incredibly important and incredibly risky. A massive chunk of it has to travel through one tiny little strip of water, the Strait of Hormuz. We're talking about roughly 20% of the entire world's oil supply passing through this one narrow choke point. That makes it one of the most important and one of the most vulnerable shipping lanes on Earth. But here's the thing. No matter how much there is, it's not infinite. It will run out someday. And that leads us to our final and maybe most important questions. How long can this really last? And what's next for a part of the world that has been completely defined by its oil? Let's get into that in our final part. So, the billion-dollar question, how long do they have? Well, if you look at what's called the Reserve Life Index, which is basically how many years they have left if they keep pumping at today's rates, the numbers are pretty mind-blowing. We're not talking about it running out in 10 or 20 years. For countries like Iran and Kuwait, we're talking about over 100 years. Even for Saudi Arabia, it's decades and decades. So just from a do they have the oil perspective, yeah, their influence isn't fading anytime soon. But don't think for a second they're just sitting back and relaxing. They know the world is changing, and they are writing their next chapter right now. For starters, they're using more of their own natural gas for electricity so they can sell every last drop of the more valuable oil abroad. They're also pouring unbelievable amounts of money, hundreds of billions of dollars, into these huge national vision plans to build economies that don't depend on oil at all. And yep, they're even making big investments in renewable energy, all while dealing with the increasing pressure to clean up the environmental side of their business. And that brings us right back to where we started, just trying to comprehend the sheer scale of it all. It took 500 million years of just the right geology, just the right chemistry, just the right luck to create this incredible store of energy. And it took us less than 100 years to build our entire modern world on it. So as our world starts to shift and look for new sources of energy, the biggest question of all is, what comes next for the land of black gold?